Have you ever noticed how some people move through life almost invisible? They're not loud, they're not disruptive. They don't demand attention. Instead, they shrink themselves, always careful not to be a burden, always watching the room instead of filling it. And if you look closely enough, you'll see it. The quiet sadness in their eyes, the way they hesitate before speaking, as if they've already convinced themselves that their words won't matter. These are often the grown-up versions of emotionally neglected children. And the truth is, their loneliness didn't start yesterday or even last year. It started decades ago, in the very place that was supposed to feel safest, home. When people think of neglect, they often picture something obvious, like a child left without food or shelter. But emotional neglect is far more subtle, and in some ways even more invisible. It doesn't leave bruises on the skin. It leaves them on the heart. And because it's so quiet, so ordinary, many who grow up this way don't even realize what's missing. They just know something feels off. They know that while other children laughed freely, cried openly, and spoke without fear, they learned to hold it all in. They learned early on that their emotions were either too much or not enough. And so they build a survival strategy: silence. Research in developmental psychology shows us just how damaging this silence can be. Dr. Sarah Miller, who has written extensively on childhood emotional neglect, explains that children don't need perfect parents. They don't need every single emotion validated. What they need is to feel seen, soothed, and understood most of the time. When that doesn't happen, when parents are too distracted, overwhelmed, or emotionally unavailable, the child begins to feel invisible. And invisibility, when carried for years, becomes one of the heaviest burdens a human being can bear. What makes this even harder is that unlike trauma caused by direct harm, emotional neglect is defined by what doesn't happen. There's no one dramatic moment to point to. Instead, it's the thousands of little moments when a child says, "I'm scared," and no one comforts them. When they cry, and no one asks why. When they're excited, but no one mirrors their joy. Slowly, they stop reaching out. Slowly, they learn that their inner world isn't welcome. And as adults, they continue this pattern, often without even realizing it. Think about the way this shows up later in life. The emotionally neglected child grows into the adult who feels disconnected in relationships, even when surrounded by people. They may appear independent, capable, even strong. But underneath that exterior lies a persistent question: do I really matter to anyone? And because they never learned how to trust their emotions, they often struggle to know themselves. They doubt their instincts. They suppress their needs. They work endlessly to prove their worth. Yet inside, they carry an emptiness that no achievement can fill. Loneliness in this sense isn't just about being alone. It's about being unknown. Studies have shown that chronic loneliness can have the same impact on health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It increases the risk of depression, anxiety, and even physical illnesses like heart disease. And when we trace the roots of this loneliness, so often we find the same story. A child who learned that their feelings didn't matter. Now, it's important to pause here and say this. Most parents who create emotional neglect are not cruel or malicious. Many of them were emotionally neglected themselves. They love their children. They provide for them. They want the best. But love without attunement can still wound. A parent might say, "Stop crying. You're fine," thinking it builds resilience, when in reality, it teaches the child to doubt their pain. A parent might dismiss excitement with "calm down. It's not a big deal," believing they are keeping their child grounded, when really they are telling them, "Your joy is too much." Over time, these subtle messages accumulate. and the child learns not to trust their own inner world. What's fascinating is how adaptable children are. To survive, they develop masks. Some become the perfect child, always achieving, always excelling, trying to earn the love and attention they crave. Others become the invisible one, withdrawing, staying quiet, trying not to take up space. And some act out, misbehaving, not because they want trouble, but because even negative attention feels better than no attention at all. Each of these masks hides the same truth: a deep hunger to be seen and valued. As adults, these masks don't just disappear. The perfectionist continues to overwork, burning themselves out while secretly feeling unworthy. The invisible one avoids conflict, avoids vulnerability, avoids risk because somewhere inside they believe they don't deserve more. The rebel might sabotage relationships or push people away before they can leave, all rooted in the same fear of abandonment that began in childhood. On the surface, these lives may look different, but underneath they share the same thread: the loneliness of not having their inner world acknowledged. One of the greatest tragedies of emotional neglect is how it distorts self-perception. Because the neglect is invisible, children often conclude, "It must be me. Something must be wrong with me." Instead of recognizing my needs weren't met, they internalize I shouldn't have needs at all. And this belief can persist for decades, leading to low self-esteem, difficulty trusting others, and even a sense of emptiness that is hard to describe in words. It's not sadness exactly, it's not anger. It's more like a quiet, persistent absence, like a house where all the furniture is missing. You can walk through the rooms, but nothing feels lived in. Yet, despite all this, there's another truth that must be told. Healing is possible, and it starts with naming what's happened. For so many emotionally neglected children, the first step is simply realizing that they are not broken and they are not alone. That the emptiness they feel is not proof of defectiveness, but rather a natural response to what was missing. This recognition alone can be profoundly freeing because it shifts the blame from self to circumstance. In fact, studies in neuroplasticity show that the brain can adapt and rewire throughout life. Just because you were neglected as a child does not mean you are doomed to loneliness forever. When you begin to acknowledge your feelings, when you start practicing self-compassion, when you seek relationships that validate and nurture you, you are literally teaching your brain a new way of being. Slowly, room by room, the empty house inside you can begin to fill. But the process is not easy, because when you've spent years suppressing emotions, the act of feeling them again can be overwhelming. Imagine being underwater for years and suddenly gasping for air. The intensity can be both terrifying and liberating. Many adults who were emotionally neglected as children struggle with this. They may find themselves crying without knowing why, or feeling anger they can't quite explain, or experiencing joy that feels fragile and fleeting. This is not weakness. This is the soul relearning what it means to be alive. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is that the loneliness of emotionally neglected children is not a life sentence. It is a wound, and like all wounds, it can heal with time, care, and awareness. But healing requires the opposite of what caused the wound. It requires being seen, being heard, being understood. Sometimes that comes through therapy. Sometimes it comes through safe relationships. Sometimes it begins with the simple act of telling yourself, "My feelings matter." And here's the paradox. The very sensitivity that made you feel so unseen as a child can become your greatest strength as an adult. Because you know what it feels like to be invisible, you can become someone who truly sees others. Because you know the pain of dismissal, you can offer compassion that is rare and profound. Many of the most empathetic, intuitive and creative people in the world were once emotionally neglected children. Their loneliness became a kind of strange soil, out of which something beautiful could still grow. Now we must step into the harder but more liberating territory. What it really takes to heal, and what it means to reclaim a life that was never fully lived. Because here's the truth. Loneliness may be the shadow of childhood neglect, but it does not have to be your destiny. The fact that you are even listening, even curious about this, shows something powerful. That a part of you still believes in connection, still longs for wholeness, still hopes that it is possible to live differently. And that spark is enough. Let's begin with the most fundamental shift, moving from self-blame to self-standing. For many who grew up emotionally neglected, the default inner dialogue is self-criticism. Why can't I just be normal? Why do I feel so empty? Why do I mess up relationships? This self-blame is like an echo of childhood, when the child assumed they were the problem, rather than realizing their needs weren't met. But healing begins when you stop asking what's wrong with me, and start asking what happened to me. That question changes everything. It removes shame and replaces it with compassion. And compassion is the soil where true growth begins. Psychologists emphasize that emotional neglect doesn't just deprive children of comfort. It deprives them of a crucial skill, emotional literacy. If your feelings were dismissed or ignored, you never learn to name them, regulate them, or express them safely. That's why so many adults with this history struggle to even identify what they're feeling. One powerful practice is journaling, not as a chore, but as a way of giving your inner child a voice. When you sit down with pen and paper and simply ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? You are rebuilding a bridge to parts of yourself that were silenced. Over time, this practice helps you differentiate between sadness and anger, between fear and excitement. It helps you realize that feelings are not dangerous. They are information, and once you learn to listen, they can guide you toward the life you've always deserved. Another key step is cultivating relationships that validate you. For someone who grew up emotionally neglected, this can feel risky. Trust doesn't come easily. Vulnerability feels foreign. You may even fear being too much or not enough. But human beings are wired for connection, and healing rarely happens in isolation. Even one safe relationship, whether with a friend, a partner, or a therapist, can begin to repair the loneliness. Studies on attachment have shown that secure relationships in adulthood can actually rewire the brain, creating a sense of safety that was missing in childhood. This is why it's so important to seek out people who listen without judgment, who honor your emotions instead of dismissing them. Because every time someone responds with care, it sends a powerful message to your nervous system. You matter. You are not invisible anymore. But what if those safe people feel hard to find? What if your family doesn't understand, or your social circle isn't supportive? This is where another form of healing enters: reparenting yourself. It may sound abstract, but it simply means becoming the attentive parent to yourself that you never had. When you feel sad, instead of dismissing it the way your parents might have, you pause and comfort yourself. When you feel joy, you let yourself fully celebrate instead of shutting it down. When you feel fear, you acknowledge it gently instead of shaming yourself for being weak. Over time, these small acts of inner parenting add up. They teach you that your emotions are valid, your needs are real, and you are worthy of care. Of course, healing isn't linear. Some days you may feel progress, more grounded, more connected. Other days you may slip back into old patterns of numbing or withdrawing. This is normal. Remember, you are undoing years, sometimes decades of conditioning. What matters is not perfection, but persistence. Each time you choose to feel instead of suppress. Each time you reach out instead of retreat. Each time you validate yourself instead of criticizing. You are rewiring your inner world. It's also important to address the body in this process. Emotional neglect doesn't just live in the mind. It lives in the body. Children who learn to suppress emotions often learn to tighten their muscles, hold their breath, or shrink their posture as a way of staying unnoticed. As adults, this can show up as chronic tension, shallow breathing, or even physical illness. Practices like yoga, breath work, or simply mindful stretching can help release this stored tension. By reconnecting with your body, you reconnect with parts of yourself that were long ignored. And that physical grounding can provide a sense of safety that words alone cannot. Now, let's return to the theme of loneliness. For the emotionally neglected child, loneliness became normal. They grew up believing that disconnection was just the way life is. But loneliness is not destiny. It's a signal. It's your soul's way of saying, I was meant for more than this. I was meant to be known. When you reframe loneliness this way, it becomes less of a curse and more of a compass, pointing you back toward connection. And here's the paradox. Sometimes the first step out of loneliness is learning to be fully present with yourself. Because when you can sit with your own emotions, without shame, without fear, you stop being a stranger to yourself. And once you are no longer a stranger to yourself, you are more open to authentic connection with others. Let's also acknowledge that emotional neglect is not rare. Studies suggest that millions of adults carry its effects, often without realizing it. This means you are not alone, not even close. In fact, your story may be far more common than you think. And this commonality brings with it a hidden gift, empathy. When you begin to heal, when you begin to understand your own loneliness, you also begin to understand the loneliness of others. You become the person who notices when someone else feels unseen. You become the voice that says, I understand. And in a world where so many are silently suffering, that empathy is a profound form of service. Ultimately, the lonely life of emotionally neglected children can transform into something else. A life of conscious connection. Not the shallow connection of endless scrolling or small talk, but the deep connection that comes when you are willing to be seen as you are and willing to see others as they are. This is the journey from invisibility to presence, from silence to voice, from emptiness to meaning. But it begins with a choice. The choice to stop blaming yourself. The choice to start listening inward. The choice to risk vulnerability even when it feels unfamiliar. The choice to believe that you are worthy of being known. These choices, repeated day after day, slowly dismantle the old patterns of neglect and replace them with something new. Self-respect, self-trust, and authentic connection. And if you take nothing else away from this, let it be this. The loneliness you feel is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that you are human. It is proof that you were wired for connection. And it is proof that even if your childhood denied you that connection, you can still create it now. Healing may be slow. It may be imperfect. But every step you take toward being seen, even by yourself, is a step out of the shadows and into life. So yes, the lonely life of emotionally neglected children is real. It is heavy. It leaves marks that can last decades. But it is not the end of the story, because you are not doomed to stay invisible. You are not destined to remain unknown. You are capable of building a life where your emotions are honored, where your voice is heard, where your presence is felt. And when you do, you don't just heal yourself, you help heal the world. Because every time one person chooses connection over silence, compassion over dismissal, presence over neglect. They make it easier for others to do the same. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the cycle finally breaks. Not through perfection, not through erasing the past, but through the simple radical act of choosing to be fully alive here and now.